years and you would be the majority. Then you can have it all. Why are you sitting here with me negotiating for 22%? And Farah said, if we sat on our hands for 15 years, we would be the majority. And in another 80 years of struggle, we would have a Palestinian state. But I have children. And I want them to have a life. And if we can have peace now, on a basis that is viable, I'll take it. That's been the decision of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It's been endorsed in elections and in numerous ways in public opinion polls by the Palestinian people living in Palestine. If one wanted, so assuming that we're talking about a peace between Israel and Palestine, the question then becomes, how do you get there? Boycotts, sanctions, and divestment, especially sanctions, which are the most powerful of the three, generally don't work. America has been sanctioning Cuba for, what, 50 years? The regime is still in place. They're unhappy, but they're firmly behind their government. America has been developing sanctions against Iran. Iran just gets tougher and tougher. America had sanctions for years against China. It didn't bring down the regime. The one major exception is South Africa, and South Africa is different from all the others for a very important reason. In South Africa, the nations of the world were attacking a regime that represented a minority. The majority of the population had no stake whatsoever in the regime. So the goal was to bring down the regime, and the majority of the population was willing to accept that, and so in the end, the minority lost control and had to give up. The situation in Israel is that the Jewish Israelis are not the minority. They are a strong majority in what constitutes the State of Israel. They control, under military occupation, neighboring territory that the world has designated to be a Palestinian state. That's the consensus of the world community. Now, how do you get Israel to pull its troops out of the West Bank? That's the real dilemma. How do you get Israel to pull its troops out of the West Bank? After the PLO accepted resolution, what was it, accepted the partition plan of 1947, the first Intifada began. It was a rock-throwing engagement, but it was essentially non-violent. Rather than picking up weapons and killing Israelis, they threw rocks. It was organized and spearheaded by a fellow named Mohammed Awad in East Jerusalem. He was a student of Martin Luther King's. He studied in Atlanta. And he explained to me the same thing that my rabbi explained to me when I was trying to get a non-conscientious objection deferment in '67 against Vietnam. Non-violence is not an abhorrence of violence. It's a way of irritating the occupier or the oppressor in a way that causes them to overreact, brings out their brutality, and shows their home population what the occupation has brought them to. That's what Gandhi did to the British population and developed revulsion at what Britain had become. That's what King did in the South. He got the American people to revolt against what they had allowed their country to become. Gandhi actually wrote to Martin Buber in the late 30s. He suggested that nonviolence was the way to save the Jews of Germany and Europe by arousing the conscience of the German people. And Buber's response was, what conscience? There are times when that doesn't work. In order to get the consent, now the peace process resulted, 88 resulted in 93, in the agreement to work toward a two-state solution. The collapse of that negotiation, which didn't really collapse, they were still talking after Camp David, and the second Intifada destroyed the peace process. The return of violence convinced Israelis that they were not safe. And in order to convince Israelis to trust withdrawal, which is necessary for their self-preservation, one must win again their trust that there can be nonviolence, that they will be accepted. So a movement that is based on nonviolently getting them to give up their country is no movement at all. What's needed is a movement, as Kathleen said, you could boycott items from the territories. You could boycott items from the settlements. You can develop many ways of non-violently showing the Israeli people it's in their interest to withdraw from the territories and concede the creation of a viable Palestinian state. But you won't convince them of that by telling them that you intend to dismantle their state, and you won't convince them by telling them lots of us aren't violent. Lots of us aren't violent isn't enough. Israelis have to control their settlers. Palestinians have to control their, well, in both cases it's religious extremes. But if Israelis feel that they're going to be shelled from Ramallah, they won't pull back. They need to understand that this will be the end of the dispute. That they will have their country and the Palestinians will have their country. The majority of Palestinians are ready to accept that. They're not yet ready to confront the radicals among them, although the PLO is now showing signs of it, to say, don't screw this up. We need the Israelis to agree. Israel is about as ready to confront the settlers and tell them to pull out as the Palestinians are to confront, well, the Palestinians are closer, they're confronting Hamas. Israel has yet to seriously confront the settlers. But until each side believes it will get its minimum, there will be no peace, and everything else simply contributes to the growth of mistrust. Let me read one last thing. Toronto Film Festival. What was that? About a year ago. There was a program in the film festival to create a city, a world city, for the first year, and that world city the first year was going to be Tel Aviv. Because Tel Aviv had been chosen as the world city, and it was clearly a propaganda victory for the Israeli government, no question about that, a number of artists announced that they were pulling out of the film festival. Let me read you one of the responses to that announcement. Thousands of Palestinians have died through the years because the Israeli government, military, and part of the population fervently believe that the Arab states, and indeed much of the world, do not want Israel to exist. How then are we halting this never-ending cycle of violence by promoting the very fears that cause it? Many citizens of Tel Aviv are particularly aware of the situation of the Palestinians and are concerned about their government's policies and their country's future. None more so than the Tel Aviv creative community. This is exemplified by Israeli films that criticize the government's behavior. These citizens of Tel Aviv and their organizations and their cultural outlets should be applauded and encouraged. This was written by Vanessa Redgrave last year in response to the proposed boycott of Israeli films at the Toronto Film Festival. You win the fight for Palestinian freedom by making partners of the Israeli people. You lose it by telling them that they stink. You don't win a fight by telling somebody that they stink.
Okay, thanks to all four of you for putting out a lot of food for thought. I'm going to ask a couple quick follow-up questions, and then we're going to open up the floor. We have a packed room, so when I do open up the floor, you're welcome to make statements or ask questions, whatever you prefer, but we ask that you keep it to a minute because we really are trying to maximize the number of people in this very happily packed space who are going to get to say a word or two. So as you think about what you're going to say, think about how to say it briefly and pithily, and we will have a timekeeper, and when she holds up the time card, I don't know what I'm going to do, throw a frisbee at you or something. But I did want to start, I guess, with you, Kathleen, and say, I think there's a feeling among many people of frustration at the pace of change, or the sense that there is more regress than progress. And if the tools of BDS are not the tools to use to escalate pressure at this time, what can we use? That goes beyond the arsenal of tactics that we've all been using, some of us for many years and some of us for many, many, many years.
Well, I certainly agree that things have gotten worse and worse and worse. I saw a poll today that was taken in Israel within the last week. I don't know how many of you saw it. You probably all get 8 billion emails a day, as I do. That something like